The British filmmaker Peter Watkins died at the end of October 2025, leaving behind a body of work that is fascinating, often challenging and stylistically radical. Watkins is most noted for pioneering a style typically labelled docudrama, or, in his own words, the reconstructed newsreel, notably in two works from the mid-1960s for intended broadcast on the BBC, Culloden and the Oscar-winning The War Game. The first of these was a reconstruction of the disastrous 18th century Jacobite uprising in English-occupied Scotland, and challenged the conventional definition of documentary through its device of the historical participants being interviewed by an anachronistic TV crew. The War Game was even more radical, its primary challenge being posed by applying familiar documentary techniques to a scenario, a nuclear strike on Kent, that had not actually happened, what we might call a pre-constructed event. As in Culloden, the participants are again subjected to interruptions from an unseen newsreel team to deliver vox pops. This happens even when suffering from radiation sickness, grieving the dead, or preparing for an execution of looters. This pre-construction is self-evidently imagined, though scrupulously supported with factual evidence. It looks like a documentary film, but we might ask, what is it? The visceral horrors of a potential nuclear war are presented through a dryly ironic reflection of the conventions of news reporting. This would become hugely influential on the development of the mockumentary style that was later made popular through films such as This Is Spinal Tap, though Watkins' own films are far from humorous, bleakly sardonic perhaps, but never funny. 30-odd years earlier, the Scottish filmmaker John Grierson had coined the term documentary for fact-based filmmaking. Grierson had set out in the 1930s the aims of the documentarian as the creative treatment of actuality, recognising that any form of factual filmmaking must have an element of artifice, from the selection of sources to the final edit. By a literal reading of Grierson's definition, Watkins' docudramas are certainly that, even if they purposely blur the lines of fact and fiction. Nonetheless, the film achieves a palpable sense of realism, so much so that Watkins was lauded by the British Film Institute's obituary for his innovative cross-framing of fact and fiction. The War Game thus consciously utilises the characteristic techniques of documentary film language and structure, such as the authoritative voiceover of the observational mode, the presentation of evidence to make a case, or the visual characteristics of found footage. Matched with its hypothetical content, this results in a self-evident dissonance between subject and technique. Watkins' stated intent was to recreate the type of television programme which may have reported on this event and simultaneously offer a critique of this sort of representation. The War Game's dry, factual evidence is delivered by a genuine BBC newsreader, Michael Aspel, with the authoritative, trustworthy and familiar style of delivery, the received pronunciation that a contemporary audience would have understood as responsible and trustworthy, the expert voice of God required of the expository mode of documentary. The handheld cinematography gives a strong impression of immediacy through sudden zooms, use of telephoto lenses, whip pans, refocusing mid-shot, seemingly spontaneous framing and long shot duration. The camera is sometimes pushed directly into the faces of the shocked, charred and mutilated. In the firing squad scene or during explosions, the camera judders in shock, suggesting the aesthetic quality and immediacy of photo reportage. This all gives an impression of urgency and rawness, as if capturing events in real time. In addition, more conventional talking head shots of experts or vox pop interviews are made more shocking when intercut with the visceral horror of burns victims, sickness and trauma. This device typically exposes the levels of ignorance, blindness or stupidity of the apparent experts. The editing contrasts long-duration shots such as the opening motorbike ride or the doctor's home visit that is interrupted by the nuclear strike with sequences such as the firestorm, structured through a montage of jump cuts and short-duration shots assembled to reflect the panic and chaos. The direct-to-camera address by amateur actors fulfills two functions. First, it utilises an approach to performance that we might link to the typage of Sergei Eisenstein's work in the 1920s, or the aesthetic of the films of Robert Bresson, in which the element of professional acting is stripped away. This perhaps gets closer to the awkwardness typical of the conventional vox pop interview, and purports to give a voice to people outside the media industry, enhancing the impression of verisimilitude. Second, by using amateur actors sometimes performing themselves, sometimes in character, the direct address becomes a breaking of the fourth wall, which takes that verisimilitude and deconstructs the convention it is imitating. Fiction is seemingly collapsed while documentary seems impossible. We cannot help but remain aware that what we are seeing is neither, and yet both. However, Watkins grounds his fiction in what must have been exhaustive research. He uses statistics taken from the Hiroshima, Nagasaki and Dresden bombings. He quotes from sources such as NATO briefings and government documents. The effects of radiation sickness, civil unrest, the breakdown of order, the shooting of the wounded and so on are all meticulously referenced. The dry data makes the simulated suffering much more impactful. This obvious dissonance between subject and technique has an evident equivalent in the intended alienation effect of Brechtian theatre. We question how a contemporary camera crew might be present, how the film is constructed, and who might sit down to watch the film in a post-apocalyptic Britain. The dissonance forces the spectator to recognise the constructed nature of the work, thereby challenging our acceptance of the documentary itself as objective truth. In subverting audience expectations, Watkins' aim is to provoke critical engagement. Over the course of his career, Watkins became increasingly critical of the mainstream media, perhaps stung because of the BBC's refusal to broadcast the war game. Watkins aimed increasingly to achieve a deeper truth. He came to argue that traditional notions of documentary objectivity promoted by the mass audiovisual media, in his words, are in fact media-cultivated myths of reality and truth, designed for commercial purposes and passive audiences, a phenomenon he termed the monoform. His definition of the monoform was false, stale and authoritarian filmmaking that uses a structured audiovisual language, characterised by fast-paced narratives designed for commercial reasons, that assumes an audience is passive and unquestioning. He thought of this as deafening. In contrast, Watkins aimed to allow his viewer thinking time. Note how at key points the wargame positions the sound of screaming chaos and explosions alongside the strategic use of silence. This, alongside the use of freeze frames, functions as a pause to allow implications to sink in. Hence, Watkins recreates the type of television programme that might be reporting on these events, impossible though that might seem, and in turn offer a critique of that very representation. This self-reflexivity asks us to become critical of how information is packaged and consumed and typically serves a political or commercial agenda. If the war game deliberately employs overfamiliar documentary conventions in unconventional settings, then a more profound political and human reality is considered. Look at the sequence when the film directly quotes an Anglican bishop who says he believes in the war of the just. The subsequent cut to a burning car with the narrator stating, "In this car, a family is burning alive," exposes the disconnect between government policy and religious acceptance and the human catastrophe it would unleash as moral hypocrisy. To sum up, in employing self-reflexive and synthetic techniques, Watkins aimed to counterintuitively convey truth through artifice. However, the war game was so politically potent that the BBC banned its broadcast for 20 years, proving that it probably got too near the truth for someone's comfort. That the film went on to receive a cinematic release and international critical acclaim proves its undoubted potency.